Yeah, I mean, this is our biggest win of the season for sure. The next one's going to be the biggest one. So, we're in playoff mode right now. We can't afford anything, losses and, giving up points. So, it was a big effort in the third to get the win in regulation.
Nick Suzuki, playoff mode. The Canadiens are in playoff mode, but what if they make the playoffs? They are in a playoff position for the third time in 2025, January 7th, January 22nd, and now March 19th, holding on to the final wild card spot. It's Habs Lunch, Campbell versus Gallo. I'm Sean Campbell. He's Mitch Gallo. Mitch, if the Habs get in the playoffs, are they just there and happy to be there, or could they actually disrupt things in the Eastern Conference?
I mean, it's a great question because you have to kind of flip the switch. You have to be able to turn it up for the playoffs, and right now the goal is just to make it. So are you going to be content when you get there? And maybe early in a playoff series, they might be a little bit overwhelmed. I do think they have enough experience to maybe mitigate that just a little bit. But I think for some of the younger players on the team and some of the guys in their first playoff, maybe raising their game to another level could be challenging early after accomplishing the goal of making the playoffs. If it was the Western Conference, Campbell, I would tell you that the Canadiens have a very small chance of creating any havoc. But in the Eastern Conference, the conference that I don't feel is as strong or as top heavy, there's no reason why the Montreal Canadiens can't go into a playoff thinking, well, anything can happen in this series. Do I think they can do it, for 3 series and find a way to the Stanley Cup? Probably not. But if you match up against the Washington Capitals in round 1, I know the Capitals statistically in the standings are the conference's best team. I know their plus minus differential is very strong. I know they score almost at will. But I've told you before, and I'll say it again, I feel like Washington is fraudulent and might be susceptible to a potential upset in the first round of the playoffs if they play a Montreal or a New York. I don't think they are as strong as their record says they are. And maybe I'll be proven wrong and they'll stomp on whatever team in the first round. But I would not count Montreal out of it in a playoff series against the Washington Capitals. What if they match up with the Florida Panthers? Yes, on paper, Florida seems like a much better team. And yes, Florida won the Stanley Cup last year. But head-to-head this season, I've seen the Panthers and Montreal Canadiens play twice. And Montreal has won both games. If it's Toronto against Montreal in the first round, well, I've seen Montreal play really good games against Toronto, and I've seen Toronto as a very heavy favorite get knocked off by the Canadiens just a couple years ago when the Canadiens went to the Stanley Cup final and lost to Tampa Bay. So I don't think it's probable, but I think it's possible that the Canadiens will not be an easy out if they get into the postseason, if they match up against one of these top teams like Washington, Florida, or Toronto.
If they do get in, it's very likely in that final wild card spot. In the way that it's set up, it would be the number one team, the Washington Capitals, that would be matched up against the Canadiens. But if the Canadiens get into the first wild card spot, then you're talking about the other side because Washington does have a big lead on Florida, Tampa, and Toronto for the top spot in the conference. And I think Tampa in a first round would be tough for Montreal, but like you said, the Canadiens have matched up well against Toronto and Florida this season. But the one thing I'll say is you have to look at the Canadiens and then say, who are playoff performers on the roster? And you're starting to see that right now. Nick Suzuki, and I know there's sometimes it's limited experience and seen, but Nick Suzuki and Cole Caulfield have tasted the playoffs and tasted it all the way to the Stanley Cup final. They were very young, but even at that young age, they flourished and played a role. But now there's the top dogs on the team. They're going to have to play even a bigger role. Josh Anderson, even if he's going to be taped up together and held together and not practicing, is bringing it in the playoffs. Defensively, I know that Lane Hutson's a gamer. I've never seen him play in NHL playoffs, neither of you. But Mitch, can you doubt that Lane Hutson's going to be a gamer when it comes to the playoffs? No. I'm curious about Alex Carrier and Mike Matheson, and you know what David Savard, boom, does. I guess maybe the question is, what kind of goalie is Montembeault going to be in the playoffs? And that might be the big step forward for a player like that, getting an opportunity in those situations. We're seeing it a little bit down the stretch here.
Yeah, and with Mutombo, I can't help but wonder what the experience of the Four Nations face-off would have done for him in that type of situation. Look, I know he didn't play,
Yeah.
but he was still there, experiencing how these top end players, the best players in the world, approach and prepare to play in games where the margin for error is very, very thin. He worked at practice with those guys. He watched a Jordan Binnington who, might be a roller coaster of a goaltender, but when the games seem to matter a little bit more, he finds another level. Now it's still a question mark going in, but I think Mutombo will be well equipped, at least mentally, for those games. What happens on the ice is another story altogether. And I'm with you in all the guys that you named, that I think are pretty predictable with what they will do in the playoffs. It's just a matter of, the other teams maybe being a little bit more talented and Montreal playing a certain game plan that's going to allow them to maybe steal a game or two at some point, because obviously with the teams that we're talking about, they are where they are in the standings for a reason, and you're not just going to walk through them based on talent. You're going to have to find a way to steal a couple games along the way.
And if you look at the playoff race, and I feel the same way, you mentioned the Rangers, who are just 1 point before the Canadiens. If the Rangers made the playoffs and the Canadiens didn't, I'd be worried a little bit about the Rangers, because whoever gets into that final wild card and maybe final two, I know Ottawa has a little bit of a lead here, you're probably going to be the team on the biggest heater heading into the playoffs. You're probably going to be the team riding that high. And we've seen it. Sometimes you could carry that rate in. You mentioned there's a line. Playoff hockey is different than regular season hockey. But if you're able to get that tempo up 2 weeks prior to the playoffs starting, where other teams at the top of the standings have been in cruise control, it gives you a leg up in game 1, game 2 sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. And maybe that's a little bit of a benefit for a team like Montreal that's going to be driving for the playoffs. You're not talking about getting into the 1-2-3 spot or playing in a 2-3 opening round. You're talking about you're going to play one of the division winners or maybe even the conference winner in the first round, but you had to scratch and claw and grind to get there. And there's something to be said. You're either going to be exhausted or able to ride it a little bit into the first round.
Well, like you mentioned, it doesn't happen all the time, but we know plenty of examples where it did happen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, don't look past just 2 years ago when you had the Boston Bruins with one of the most historic regular seasons in NHL history go up against the Florida Panthers, who got in the last spot and had to scratch and claw in the later portions of the season, getting strong play from Alex Lyon, not even Sergei Bobrovsky, and having a lot of question marks going into that first round playoff series. Campbell, you are one that identified Boston as being susceptible to an upset. I don't know if you called them fraudulent. They were one of the best regular season teams ever,
Mm-hmm.
but you picked Florida to win that playoff series. Remember?
Yep.
You were ridiculed. You were made fun of.
And one of the reasons was because Florida had to grind to get to that number 8 spot. And they had a bunch of players on their team that I identified as playoff performers, that I felt that when they get in the playoffs, they're going to up the game. And it's a little similar. Maybe the Canadiens don't have that grind factor that Florida has. And we saw what Florida has become since that playoff run. But I identified playoff performers and the fact that they had to go down the stretch to get number 8. It's one of the reasons why I took Florida over Boston back in those days. Thank you for remembering that call, Mitch. Thank you.
Well, it was one of your better calls. Your calls aren't all great, but sometimes when you hit it on the head, I have to give you credit. And I didn't, by the way, may I say, as somebody who loves to argue with you,
Yes,
and go head to head with you,
yes,
when you made that call, I did not disagree. I did not agree with you, but I wasn't adamant that I didn't think it could happen. Other people ridiculed you completely, and mocked you, and said a whole bunch of things. Remember?
You stupid idiot! I heard that. You're supposed to.
Yeah, you were called an idiot, Campbell. You were not by me though, not by me.
No,
because I saw the crack of the window open slightly where it could happen, and it did. And you're right on that one, but. Florida's not the only team we've seen do that, and they won't be the last as well. I mean, we could go back to the St. Louis Blues the year they won the Stanley Cup, right? They came out of nowhere. They're in last place in January, and they go on to win it. So it's not the most common thing, But I feel maybe I'll be proven wrong about this, Campbell. I feel like teams that battle and get in on the last day
Yep.
have had more playoff success than teams that have won the President's Trophy in the last 15 years.
We'd have to do the research on that, but I'll tell you this: if there's a first-round series of the Montreal Canadiens versus the Washington Capitals, I think that at least in this market, there's going to be a lot of believers to beat the Capitals. You've been calling them fraudulent all season long, along with the Winnipeg Jets, who are about to get to 100 points on the season.
I don't get it. I don't think I've ever felt this way about the two top teams in each conference. But it's just the type of season where I think the top teams are not the top teams.
I can't wait for the Stanley Cup Final, Capitals versus Jets. And you're good.
Sure.
After three rounds of the playoffs, I hope you during confessions on Campbell versus Gallo, you'd apologize to both teams.
100%. I mean, I'm not like you. I don't bat 100.
Mm-hmm.
Or actually, I don't bat 1,000. I should say. 100 is actually pretty poor.
Yeah, if you batted 100, that would suck.
Yeah, I don't bat 1,000. And I can remember the last time I was this adamant about a team being fraudulent. It was the inaugural season for the Vegas Golden Knights. They didn't end up winning the Stanley Cup, but they got within 2 games, losing to Washington that year. I didn't believe in Vegas. Kept saying I didn't believe in Vegas. Said I didn't believe in them in round 1. They won. Round 2, they won. Round 3, they won. And I said again they wouldn't win in round 4, and they didn't. But that's a case of a team that surprised me and proved me wrong. And we'll see if either the Capitals or Jets can do it this year. I don't see it with those two teams. I think there's too many teams that are better than. It's not like I think the Capitals are awful.
Mm-hmm.
But when I look at the standings in the Eastern Conference, I think the Panthers are better. I think the Lightning are better. I think the Maple Leafs are better. I think the entire Atlantic Division is better. In fact, I probably like Carolina better too. Everybody likes to really dump on Carolina because they weren't a fan of the way they handled themselves at the trade deadline, getting Rantanen and then trading Rantanen. Well, guess what, Campbell? I told you, Stankoven's a really nice pickup for them, and he's going to fit in fantastically well. And that team has won 7 games in a row. One of the other super hot teams in the National Hockey League. And then I look at the Winnipeg Jets in the West. I think Dallas is better. I think Colorado's better. I think Vegas is better. I think Edmonton's better. And I think the LA Kings are better. So it's tough for me to pick those two teams to go to the Cup Final. I just think the competition ahead of them is too tough.
But if the Canadiens got into the playoffs, could they cause a little bit of havoc? It's maybe a bit of a what-if question.